today.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone, all of our presenters. I'm very thrilled to introduce Ariel Burger, who is our speaker for today. When I was asking my colleagues around the JCC community about who would be a great person to talk about some of the great lessons from the Holocaust and that time, to really inspire us during these very difficult times. Hands down, everyone across the country told me to call Ariel Burger and to have him come and speak here today. So I'm really thrilled that we were able to work this out, even though it's virtual. You know, we're thrilled that we could make this happen. Ariel is the author of the National Book Award winning book, National Jewish Book Award winner, Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. He is the founding director and senior scholar of the Witness Institute, whose mission is to empower emerging leaders inspired by the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel. And there is a whole history of how they know each other and the teaching assistant and their relationship, but I don't want to give that away in the bio because I feel like Ariel is going to talk about that. So we're really excited for that opportunity. Ariel is an Orthodox trained rabbi, and he received his PhD in Jewish Studies and Conflict Resolution under Elie Wiesel's tutelage. He is also a recipient of the Covenant Foundation grant, which is a very prestigious Jewish education award that very few people get. So I feel very honored. And through that program, Ariel develops a cutting-edge arts and educational programming for adults, facilitates workshops for educators, and consults with nonprofits, and has served as a scholar in residence for institutions around the United States. So please give a round of applause in your houses for Ariel Burger.
Thank you, Nancy. I can hear all of you. Thank you for the applause. It's wonderful to be with all of you, and it's an honor to be in proximity to Ariel's story. You know that in Jewish thought and Jewish life and history, all the way back to Abraham and Sarah, and perhaps even earlier, blessing is a very important principle, that we can give blessings to other people, that we can somehow transmit light, life, goodness to other people through blessing. And throughout Jewish history, it was customary for people to travel, especially around this time of year before the high holidays, to great teachers to receive blessings. And a young man, not too long ago, went to his teacher and he said, "Rabbi, I came to ask you for a blessing, but I also came to ask you a question." And the question is, when we were all living in our communities, we were living in Eastern Europe, and there were many rabbis and teachers and great masters all over, in every town, every village. You could travel anywhere and you could ask for a blessing and you could receive a blessing. And it wasn't just that you were getting a blessing, you could feel it and you could see it at work in your life. And now that we've all moved to the new world, to America, and there aren't as many rabbis, and I live in a far-flung Jewish community, very far from any rabbis or teachers. I've traveled to see you, but it's not easy for me to do that. Where can I go to receive blessings when we have so few masters with us, so few blessers with us? And the rabbi said to him, "It's very simple. Go into any synagogue in the morning and wait until it's time for people to put on tefillin, the phylacteries. And when you see the men, the older men, roll up their sleeves to put on their tefillin, look for a man with a number on his arm. Ask him for a blessing. And that blessing, I promise you, is more effective than any of the blessings of any of the great masters of the past." We know this is true because we know that survivors survived, thrived, found ways to live, and took their revenge. How? By having children, by building synagogues and Jewish community centers and schools and businesses and communities, by choosing life, by choosing joy, by choosing hope. And one of the things that I think about very often nowadays in difficult moments, and the world is in a difficult place, as we all know, I often think, if they could do it, then we can do it. And this is something that I saw first in my life when I met Elie Wiesel, when I was 15 years old, living in New York, growing up in a complicated family, going to a very, very Orthodox day school. And in that school, we studied the ancient texts, the Bible and the Talmud and the commentaries. And I was the kid in school who was always drawing in the page of the Talmud, in the corners of the page, in the margins of the page, doodling superheroes and battles and spaceships. And I would get in trouble for it, but I couldn't stop. I was the artsy kid in the class. And by the time I was 15, I had a lot of questions about the relationship between tradition and creativity, the life of heritage, of study, of the discipline, of observance, and the life of freedom of an artist. And I didn't really have anyone I could speak with about those questions until I met Elie Wiesel. I met Professor Wiesel at a lecture in New York that he gave to about 1,000 people. My stepfather brought me to the lecture. And afterwards, there was a small reception line where you could greet Professor Wiesel. This was in 1990, so this was 4 years after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was a well-known Jewish leader. He was well-known beyond the Jewish community. This was after the famous moment when he spoke truth to power to President Reagan, when President Reagan was going to visit a cemetery in which Nazi SS officers were buried, the cemetery at Bitburg. And Elie Wiesel spoke to the president publicly and said, "Mr. President, that place is not your place." He was a very famous man, and I was very intimidated and shy. But when it was my turn to meet Professor Wiesel, I remember to this day, he held his hand out to me, and he said his name as if I had no idea who he was. And I saw modesty, and I saw an openness. And then he said something that really would change the course of my life. He said, "Come and see me and bring a question." Now, it took me about 7 or 8 months to build what in our tradition is called the Holy Chutzpah, to really go and take him up on his offer and visit him with a question. But my questions were so burning and so urgent that eventually I did. I went to see him at his home in New York. And I didn't have one question, I had many, many questions. And that began a series of visits, a series of conversations. He was incredibly generous with his time for a young man who was searching. And I noticed something pretty quickly. After just a few meetings, I noticed that Professor Wiesel never answered my questions. And this struck me as strange at first, and I was taken aback by it. But I realized two things. Number one, I realized that this was a very Jewish response to questions. When you're asked a question in Jewish life, you ask another question, and the questions build on one another and lead somewhere. And number two, I noticed that Professor Wiesel's responses, his questions in response to my questions, or his stories, were much more helpful than answers could ever have been. Because he knew something that I didn't know at the time, which was that I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for responses. And so this went on for some time. When I was 16, 17, 18, I would meet with Professor Wiesel and ask him questions about life, about career, even sometimes about relationships when I dared. He always had great responses. He never answered my questions. And there was one question that I didn't ask him because it felt too personal, too intrusive. And that question was, having read Night and having caught a glimpse of the experience of the kingdom of night, Professor, how did you become the person that I'm getting to know, this person of great joy and great hope and great curiosity and great love of chocolate rugelach and great sense of wonder when you encounter a new story or a new text or the question of a student that you may have heard before? What gave you that hope, that joy, that openness, that curiosity? I didn't ask the question. I had to wait several years until I was sitting in Professor Wiesel's classroom at Boston University, where he taught for many, many years. And I went to BU because Professor Wiesel was there and I wanted to study with him. And in one of those classes, a student asked my question. And I was very grateful to her. She raised her hand and she asked this question: Professor, how did you become a person of joy? How did you not give up? How did you keep going after the Holocaust? And he said, first, if you're asking me how I survived, I couldn't tell you. I have no answer. He said, I was not as strong as some of the others. I was less well connected in the camps than some others. And at certain moments, I didn't even have a lot of motivation to live. So I can't tell you anything about how I survived or why. But if you're asking me how I kept going afterwards, that I can tell you. He said, it's easy. It was learning that saved me. It was my love of learning that saved my sanity and my hope. And then he told us the story that on the day of liberation, which, by the way, if you read Night, which I'm sure many of you have, this takes place on the page after the last page of Night. Night ends in a very dark place with a young, liberated Eliezer Wiesel looking in the mirror, and a corpse is looking back. What happens next? What happens next is in this story. The young people in the camps were liberated. They were gathered together by the American Army and by the international aid organizations that were brought in to take care of the Holocaust orphans. And the adults gathered the children together. And these were children ranging from around age 6 or 7 to 18 or 19. Elie Wiesel was around 15 and a half at the time. And the adults asked the children, can we get you anything? Can we bring you anything to make your life better on this day? Now that your life has changed again. But you've all lost so much. You've lost people close to you. What can we give you? And Professor Wiesel told us, I remember a young woman, a young girl asked for a piece of chocolate because she didn't remember what chocolate tasted like. And he said, I remember a young boy asked for a sweater or a coat because he hadn't been warm for 3 years. But I asked, he continued, for the same volume of Talmud, the great compendium of Jewish law and legend that I was studying before the war, before the deportation, so that I could continue my studies from the exact same line in the exact same word where my studies were interrupted by the Nazis. And that is what saved me. My love of learning, my return to learning saved me. And then he added, I believe that learning can save us all. Now, Larry spoke beautifully, articulately about the challenge of Holocaust memory and the moral power and weight, the lessons of the Holocaust. And that memory is a kind of endangered species today, for all the reasons that Larry pointed out. The Claims Conference study is one in a series of disturbing studies that show the amnesia, sometimes willful, usually not. It's usually not the young people's fault. It's a fault in our educational systems. We have a crisis on our hands. And Professor Wiesel told us learning can save us. Learning can help us restore our memory and our commitment to moral values, to make sure that we personally don't ever give up hope, that we continue to be agents of good in the world, but also to make sure that the travesties, the atrocities of the past are not repeated. So when Professor Wiesel said this, I thought, sitting in his classroom, I believe in education. I love education. I think it's very important. But if you think about it, And if you study the history of the Holocaust, you know that education did not prevent the Holocaust, that many of the Holocaust's authors and architects were highly educated people. Many of the SS officers had PhDs. They were students of Kant and Goethe, lovers of Beethoven and Bach. Germany was known as the cultural capital of the West, and this did not prevent a Holocaust. This didn't prevent the killers from killing, and it didn't prevent those who were standing by from being indifferent and signaling to Irene that you're going to your deaths, signaling with glee. It didn't prevent that. And so I wanted to ask Professor Wiesel, Professor, what do you mean that learning can save us? What kind of learning do you mean? What secret ingredient in learning can save us, where it did not save us then? And eventually I asked him that question, and that began a conversation that lasted several decades about the power of education and a certain kind of education. And for Professor Wiesel, the secret ingredient in education was his favorite word, the word memory. And the word memory, when Elie Wiesel spoke the word memory, you heard it with a capital M, because it was a sacred word for him, as I believe it must be for us. And by memory, he did not only mean remembering information and transmitting information about the past, although that is critically important, and that is also endangered now, when we have 66% of millennials who cannot identify Auschwitz, 23%, as Larry pointed out, who cannot identify or explain what the Holocaust was, and so on. That is a crisis. It's important to hold on to and transmit the facts of the past. But by memory, Professor Wiesel meant something more. Memory also means the empathic encounter with other people's stories. If you were watching the video about Irene and you got goosebumps or tears came to your eyes, then you were experiencing the power of sacred memory. When a story enters you, and when a story enters you, it doesn't leave. And so Professor Wiesel believed very deeply in the power of education, but this kind of education, telling stories of the past that can change the moral lives of young people in particular, but of people of all ages and from many, many backgrounds, in such a way that they will be less likely to turn away when they see human suffering. And they will be more likely to take responsibility for others, whether it's a homeless person that you pass on the street every day, or someone you read about who is suffering right now on September 13th, 2020, in Syria, Myanmar, or Xinjiang, or other places across the globe. We have to take responsibility for one another, and it's not enough to say those words. We have to somehow feel it. We have to find a way, a method of being changed so that our minds are changed, our hearts are changed, our nervous systems are changed so that we cannot look away when people are suffering, and we feel the unity and the connection underlying all the differences that we often emphasize. This was Elie Wiesel's deep belief in education, the power of memory. And it was mirrored by his belief that memory is transmittable, that if someone lived a story, it's possible to tell the story. Now, this was not a simple thing for Elie Wiesel, because if you know anything about the process by which he wrote Night, his first book, his memoir of the Holocaust, you know that after the war, after liberation, he took a vow of silence for 10 years. He said, I'm not going to speak about the experience, I'm not going to write about the experience for 10 years. And as a young journalist in France, spending some time in Israel, traveling elsewhere, he wrote about all kinds of things. There's a newspaper article that was just discovered or unearthed that Elie Wiesel wrote for the Forwards, the Yiddish Daily Forward, about Disneyland, about his visit to Disneyland in the 50s, the late 50s or early 60s. And he interviewed many Jewish leaders. He met David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, others. He wrote about many topics. He did not write or speak about the Holocaust for 10 years. Why? Because he felt that on the one hand, there's a sacred responsibility to tell the story. On the other hand, how is it possible to tell the story? Once in class, Professor Wiesel was telling us that he was years earlier, he was sitting with a close friend of his, Rabbi Menashe Klein, who became a great rabbinic leader in the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community. They were from the same town, from Siget in Hungary, Romania, Transylvania. Depending on the year, the country border and names changed. They went through the Holocaust together, they went through the camps together, and they were retelling their experiences. And at a certain point, Elie Wiesel turned to his close friend, Rabbi Menashe Klein. He said, Menashe, did that really happen? And Rabbi Menashe Klein turned to Elie Wiesel and said, I was there, and I can't believe that really happened. And so if someone who was there couldn't believe that such darkness is possible, how are they going to convey, how are they going to tell the story to others who weren't there? How are they going to make people believe it? And how are they going to help people understand the immensity of the experience? It's really not possible. And yet, there's a sacred responsibility to tell the story. So Elie Wiesel took an oath not to speak about it for 10 years so that he could search for the words and the way to tell the story. And then, when he started writing about his experience, he wrote a book, and the book was around 867 pages long. It was written first in Yiddish. It was titled, And the World Remains Silent. It was a condemnation of the world's indifference, and it told the story of his Holocaust experience in 867 pages. And then he started editing, and he started cutting, and he started removing sections of the story to reduce it to its essence. And what was left was a book that's around 112, 113 pages long. It's the book that we know as Night, which is now taught in schools around the world. And I asked Professor Wiesel, why did you write Night like that, through a process of cutting and editing? He said, Ariel, you're a painter, so you know that when you're painting, you add layers of color. Writing for me is not like painting. Writing for me is like sculpture, where the sculptor imagines or sees an image hiding in a block of marble and removes all the excess to reveal that form. That's what writing is like for me. And it had to be that way, he said, because it was the only way that I could convey the power of the experience, was somehow through leaving silence between the words and weaving absence into the presence of the words. And he said, when you read Night, the words that I removed are still there. You can feel them. And I thought you can feel them in the way that we can feel the presence of the absence of the 6 million in our lives. Consciously or subconsciously, we feel the presence of their absence. And Night is written that way. And so the challenge of telling the story is not a simple one. It requires a lot of thoughtfulness. And we are privileged tonight to have seen a powerful example of a successful way of telling that story. Ultimately, the world depends on our memory of the past. It depends on the stories. It depends on holding on to those stories and retelling them. And one of the things that Professor Wiesel often taught us was that listening to a witness makes you a witness. That memory is transmittable, that the stories that you carry are now your stories to tell to others. And we saw this in class. Professor Wiesel, in his approach to all of these questions, you would think that he taught about memory and the power of memory and transformative education through an explicit curriculum of Holocaust education. But how many times do you think Elie Wiesel actually taught an entire course in university about the Holocaust? He did it once. In the first year that he was teaching, he taught a course on the Holocaust. And he never did it again. And I was lucky enough to see the notes, the classroom notes from that course. A student donated those notes to the archive at Boston University. And when I was writing my book, I researched many, many boxes of correspondence and all kinds of materials, and I came across these notes. And in the notes, the class is studying diary after diary of someone during the Holocaust, mostly people who did not survive. Very dark moments, filled with detail, pain. And at a certain point in the notes on the margin, the student who was taking the notes scrawled something that I couldn't quite make out. The handwriting wasn't so legible. Something about shouting, a student shouting. And I called the student who wrote the notes, and I reached out to other students who were in that class. I asked, what happened? What was that note? And they told me there was a student who had a breakdown in the class from the encounter with diary after diary of people who didn't survive telling the story. It was too much. The darkness was too much. And Professor Wiesel saw that, and he learned, I think, that he had to approach these questions in a different way. Somehow, in spite of the darkness, and in order to encounter that darkness, which is of course one of the primary challenges in Holocaust education, is how not to overwhelm students and young people with the darkness. We have to approach it through a celebration of questions and through great literature that addresses enduring questions. And so Professor Wiesel taught for 40 years at Boston University courses all under the headline called Literature of Memory. That was the headline for every course he ever taught. But every course was different. He never repeated a course in 40 years. And the course titles were things like Faith and Heresy in Ancient and Modern Literature, Poets and Authors of Exile and Memory, Literary Responses to Oppression, Hasidic Tales, the Book of Job. And in these wide-ranging explorations and examinations of literature and human questions through the lens of philosophy and novels and plays and history and Professor Wiesel's own experiences, students were able to encounter the darkness, encounter the difficult questions without succumbing to the darkness. And that was really Elie Wiesel's role as a teacher. His mission as a teacher was to help students encounter the darkness and then go beyond it and choose hope and come out the other side of that classroom experience as activated moral agents in the world, people who will do good in the world. As Elie Wiesel often said, tragedy does not define us. It is our response to tragedy that defines us. And this is very true of survivors. We see that. We bear witness to their choices, to their responses to tragedy. But it's also true of the Jewish people collectively throughout Jewish history. We've gone through a lot. What have we done with our experiences? We created academies to teach our children. We created synagogues and places to gather and pray together and celebrate life and eat kugel and herring and drink l'chaim, drink to life to one another and to choose life. And we contributed to our societies around us. And we found ways to make the world better for everyone. That was our response to suffering. And somehow, the place where the pain of our history and the joy of our response come together is, to me, the quintessential Jewish place and the quintessential Jewish feeling and sign that we are connected to our mission. And when I think about education, when I think about educating the next generation through Holocaust education and in general through Jewish education, what I try to do is bring together the pain and the joy and make sure that the pain does not ever eclipse the joy, but make sure that the joy has a little bit of that pain in it, in the same way that we break a glass at a wedding in our moment of joy, to remember that we haven't always been here, to not take for granted where we are. This was Professor Wiesel's mission writ large. But along the way, in his classroom, there were many, many different kinds of moments, and many themes were addressed. He spoke often about the power of questions, the celebration of questions, which explained for me in retrospect why he never answered my questions, because he preferred questions to answers. He said, answers can separate people, but questions bring us together. Answers close a conversation, end a conversation. Questions open new possibilities. And he also pointed out that in Hebrew, the word for question, she'elah, contains at its center the word for God, El. There's something holy and sacred about questions, and there is a quest in questions. And he asked many questions. There were lectures in which 80% of the time Professor Wiesel generated questions and elicited questions from the students and didn't answer them. If we would read the book of Job, we could spend an hour just asking questions, but the questions became deeper and deeper as we went, and a dialogue between questions was somehow created and woven together. And this is a profound teaching that one of our jobs as people and as educators and as students is to become more comfortable with questions that are not resolved, to be willing to say, I don't know, to be willing to say, I'm curious, I'm thirsty, I'm not done yet. Imagine politicians saying such a thing. How do we model this for our children? There were three primary questions that Professor Wiesel asked in his life and in his classroom. The first was, how could human beings do such terrible things to other human beings? And how can we change that? And that question propelled him to action, to moral action, to his human rights work on behalf of people who were suffering around the world, in Cambodia, in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Darfur. If he were here today, he would be shouting about what's happening in places in the world like Myanmar, to the Rohingya, to the Uyghur in Xinjiang province in China, to the Yazidi across the Middle East, and especially in Yemen and Syria. He kept shouting because, as he said, when we were going through what we went through, we heard the world's deafening silence. And so when people are suffering now, at the very least, we need them to know that we're not silent. His second question was not about humanity, it was about God. How could God allow such a thing to happen? And you know that Elie Wiesel was a very religious young boy. He writes about it, he talked about it often. When other kids were out playing ball, he was reciting Psalms or studying the sacred texts, the Talmud and others. And more than that, when he was 13, he decided with two of his friends that he wanted to study Kabbalah. He wanted to study Jewish mysticism. Of course, you know that you're not supposed to do that until you're 40 years old. And until you've studied some of the other exoteric, revealed texts like Talmud and the law, so that you're very grounded, because Kabbalah is dangerous. But young Eliezer Wiesel and his two friends wanted to study Kabbalah. They found a tutor. They studied together at night. And after a few weeks of this, one of his friends, a 13-year-old boy, lost his mind. They continued, Elie Wiesel and the other friend with the tutor. And a few weeks later, the other friend lost his mind. They both became catatonic. They couldn't speak. They were unresponsive. And Professor Wiesel told us, it's very strange to say, but I believe that if the Nazis had not invaded our town a few weeks later, I would have joined my friends in their madness. So we're talking about a boy who had a deep thirst, perhaps a too intense thirst for the divine, for a connection to God, a yearning for Jerusalem. He knew the streets of Jerusalem better than he knew the streets of his own hometown from the sacred texts. He knew the name of Jerusalem before he knew the name of his own hometown. And this was the boy whose faith was shattered by the experience of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Buna. And you read about that in Night, and you read where he writes, never will I forget the night that destroyed my faith, that killed my God forever. You remember the scene in Night where the young boy is being hanged and someone asks, where is God? And someone answers, God is there hanging on the gallows. And Professor Wiesel pointed out that many people misunderstood that quote from Night to mean that he's arguing that God is dead. And he said, I never believe that God is dead. It's harder than that. I believe that God is very much present, and therefore I have questions. If God were dead, it would be easy. God would be off the hook, but God is not off the hook. I can't let God off the hook. I have questions. And the way that Elie Wiesel described his approach to a faith that could continue to exist, but in a radically changed form from his childhood simple faith, was as a wounded faith. A faith that's built on questions, a faith that is built on, that embraces doubt, a faith that welcomes challenge to God, wrestling with God, a quarrel with God. And Professor Wiesel told us in class very often that that's how he spent his time often, even in synagogue or when he was studying a Torah text. And once he said, you know, it says in the Talmud that when a person leaves the world in 120 years, they go up to the heavenly court. The heavenly court asks the person or the person's soul certain questions about their life. But he said, you know, but when I go up to the heavens, I'm going to have a question for God. And students asked, what's the question? He said, one word, why? He lived with this radical quarrel with God for his whole life, and that was an expression of faith. A difficult relationship, he said, you can't be without God. You can be for God or against God. You can argue with God, but you can't be without God. That was his second question. His third question, so his first question, again, was how could human beings do such terrible things to others, and how can we change that? The second question, where was God, and how do we relate to a God who allowed a Holocaust to happen? And what's the role of faith? And by the way, for me and for many students, hearing that you can bring your questions into a life of faith, that you can bring all of your challenges and all the contradictions and all the discomfort that you have with certain theological concepts because of your actual lived experience, that's okay. We have permission to do that. We are supposed to bring that in to our relationship with faith. Was very liberating for many of us. The third question was when Professor Wiesel would turn to us and ask, what are you going to do about all of this? Where are you in all of that? How are you going to make things better? And students would ask Professor Wiesel, you know, we don't have a Nobel Peace Prize. We don't have a lot of money. We can't afford to put an op-ed in the New York Times when something happens in the world. What are we supposed to do? You've convinced us. We're supposed to make a difference in the world. We're supposed to feel responsible. How do we do it? And he said, often he said, look for the outstretched hand. Look for someone in your immediate vicinity who needs you. It might be someone in your family. It might be someone in your neighborhood or your community. It might be checking in on someone now when we're all experiencing isolation, physical distancing. Find a way to reach out to people who need you. It doesn't have to be big. It has to be consistent. In Professor Wiesel's class, we explored these kinds of questions. We explored themes of love and friendship, and faith and language, and madness and hope, and the role of protest. He taught us that even when you can't make a practical difference, you have to speak up, you have to protest, you have to let people know that you care and that you object to certain behaviors, certain human behaviors. And he bridged for us our inner experience of learning and growth with our roles as people who can make a difference in the world, as activists, as change makers. And he told a story once from our Jewish tradition about a man who was protesting for years at the city of Sodom, the wicked city of Sodom, the biblical city of Sodom, which was known for its wickedness, especially to strangers, its cruelty to strangers. And this man would protest for years and years, holding a sign, picketing the city, to really no effect. Nothing really changed. And one day a young child came over to him and said, "Mister, you've been here for so long. I see you every day, my whole life. I've heard that you've been here much longer than I'm even alive. And really, you're not accomplishing anything. Why don't you go home? What are you doing here?" And the man said, "If I protest, it's not to change the city. It's so that they don't change me." There's so much I could say, so many moments to share, but I want to leave time for your questions. So I'm going to share with you just two more things along the way, along the timeline of my privileged time with Professor Wiesel. Lest you think that engaging with these kinds of enduring, important, large, urgent questions created an environment that was somber, you need to understand that there was an immense emotional range. There were moments that were very intense in the class. There were also moments of great joy and laughter and humor. And Professor Wiesel would often tell jokes or funny stories. He told us once he was walking on the street in New York and a young couple walked by and he heard the young woman say to the young man, "I think that's Elie Wiesel." And then she circled back, took a glance at his face, went back to the young man and said, "No, it's not." And he laughed with a childish joy. And that joy was important, because without joy, how can we keep going? How can we keep exploring what we need to explore? And he himself had a childlike sense of joy and wonder. He told us that as a child, he was studying the Bible, and he came home one day. He was 6 or 7 years old, and he said to his mother, "Mama, you're not going to believe it. Sarah is pregnant. Sarah is going to have a baby." And his mother said, "Which Sarah?" Thinking it was one of the neighbors in the town of Sigat where they lived. He said, "Sarah and Abraham. Sarah and Abraham are going to have a baby." And he experienced it as if it was happening right then for the first time. And for him it was. And every time he read a text, he had that sense of curiosity and wonder, whether it was a biblical text or an African folktale or a Greek tragedy or the Bhagavad Gita, it didn't matter. He brought that same lens of curiosity and wonder and was modeling for us how it's possible to cultivate that sense of curiosity and that sense of joy in learning, which is the greatest weapon we have against despair. And when the world treats us the way it sometimes treats us, and we are tempted by despair, Professor Wiesel taught us that the first moral choice is the choice to not give up, the choice to continue to hope, because that's the choice that will lead to all the other choices. That's the choice that keeps you in the game. That's the choice that prevents you from leaving and leaving the world to those who will treat it with cruelty. You don't want to join the ranks of the indifferent. For Elie Wiesel, indifference is worse than hatred, because there aren't that many people who are actually filled with hatred. There are some, for sure, but there are many more people who are filled with indifference and look away and allow terrible things to happen. We don't want to be among them. We need joy, we need hope to prevent that. 3 weeks before Professor Wiesel died, we'd been together now for about 25 years. And I was his student in class, I was his teaching assistant, I was his doctoral student. We spent a lot of time together in the classroom and in private conversation. We studied Torah together. I brought my personal and professional questions to him. 3 weeks before he passed away, I saw him for the last time. And we were together for a little over an hour. And in that conversation, he left me a lot of homework. He spoke about hope. He spoke about learning. I asked him, how do you transmit that to students? How do you transmit a love of learning to students? And he said, there's no other way. You have to be it. You have to embody a love of learning. It has to be real. It's not a technique or a method. It has to be real. And if it's real, your students feel it and they start to respond to it. And then he said, you know, I learn and I learn and I learn, and I still feel like I have not yet begun. And then he looked off into the distance. This was 3 weeks before he died. He said, but I will soon. And when it was time to say goodbye, usually we would embrace. He would walk me to the elevator. But now he was frail. He was ill, he was in a wheelchair, and I was afraid to hug him because he was so frail. So I held my hand out to him, just to hold his hand for a moment, but he pulled me down into an embrace. And so I hugged him, and he kissed my cheek. And then I made to get up again, and he pulled me down on the other side and kissed my other cheek, and he whispered 2 words. The words were, one more. And those are the last words that Professor Wiesel ever said to me. One more. And you know that in many traditions, including the Jewish tradition, last meetings are important, last words can be very important. And so I thought a lot about those last words, one more. What does it mean? And it reminded me of a teaching that Professor Wiesel loved, and I'll end with this, from one of the great Hasidic masters, the Rebbe of Kutsk, who was known for his love of truth. And the Rebbe of Kutsk read the story of the Garden of Eden. And you remember the story. You remember the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve, and the serpent. And the serpent seduces Eve into eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and she gives to Adam to eat. And we have the world we have now as a result. And all the principal characters receive some sort of punishment from God or consequence from God, what's the curse or the punishment of the serpent? If you remember, the curse is threefold. Number one, you will crawl on your belly, because formerly the serpent had arms and legs, like a person, according to legend. You will crawl on your belly. Number two, you will eat of the dust of the earth. And number three, there will be perpetual conflict between you and humanity. Now, the Chutzpah Rebbe asked a question on the second consequence. God is telling the serpent that as a result of your terrible action, you will eat of the dust of the earth. And the Chutzpah Rebbe asks, what kind of curse is this? What kind of punishment is this? This sounds wonderful. The serpent will never be hungry. The serpent can go anywhere and find dust. There's always dust. The serpent will never be hungry. Everywhere he goes, there's a smorgasbord waiting for him. It's wonderful. What kind of curse is this? What kind of punishment? And the Chutzpah Rebbe responded, that itself is the worst punishment of all. To never be hungry, to never be filled with yearning, to never need another person, to never raise your eyes to the heavens hoping for a gift. That is the worst punishment of all. To be totally self-contained is the worst punishment of all. And our blessing, I believe, is that we are very thirsty and very hungry for a better world. We are very thirsty and very hungry for one more act of kindness, one more encounter of friendship, one more new relationship, one more great question, one more session of studying together, celebrating together. Even if it's through a screen, it's still real. We are here, and we are here together, and we are thirsty for more connection. And perhaps because of this physical distance, we are more thirsty than ever. We have people in our lives that we're missing a lot. That's a blessing. Even though it's painful or uncomfortable, it's a blessing. Our yearning is our blessing. And when Elie Wiesel told me one more, I believe he was telling me, consciously or not, that that's the way forward, is to cultivate that thirst, to cultivate our hopefulness, to not let go of our vision for the future in spite of all the challenges facing those visions of the future, and to choose one more act of kindness, one more moment of connection. One at a time, those small things add up. That's the way forward. And this continues to give me great hope, even in times like these. So thank you all. Let's turn to your questions. Nancy?
Ariel, thank you so much. We do have a few questions. One is that I know that Professor Wiesel passed away in 2016 and your book came out last year. So were you working on it together? Did he know that you were in the process? Did y'all discuss it? What was the genesis of the book?
Yeah, great question. So the genesis of the book was in 2008. There was a conference at Boston University in honor of Professor Wiesel's 80th birthday. And I gave a paper. I was invited, among others, to give a paper. And I gave a paper about Professor Wiesel's approach to teaching and learning. And I asked a question, a rhetorical question, which was, were we to create an institute for training teachers in Elie Wiesel's approach to learning, to moral education, what would it look like? What would be the design principles of such an institute? And then my paper was responding to that. I was laying out some of the factors and elements that I saw in his classroom that I believed we could translate for other learning contexts. And I saw Professor Wiesel a couple of days after the conference. He said, that was a good idea. And I said, what was a good idea? He said, creating an institute. But it shouldn't just be for teachers. It should also be for leaders in other fields, because journalists and human rights activists and others and religious leaders also need to consider moral questions, don't they? It's not just for teachers. And that began a conversation about creating an institute. And along the way, I said, Professor, you know, somebody needs to write a book about your classroom because nobody's ever written about it. And there's like 2.5 articles in total about you as a teacher. And if you ask Professor Elie Wiesel, who are you? He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He's a Holocaust survivor. He's a human rights activist. He's a confidant of presidents and prime ministers. He comes to class and says, I'm going to meet Gorbachev next week. What should we talk about? Or he comes back from the White House and tells us about his conversation with the president. But if you asked him who he was, he said, I'm a teacher. And yet there was very little written about this. So I said, someone needs to write a book about your classroom. And he said, you're right, you need to do it. I had not been thinking about writing a book about Professor Wiesel's classroom. I was involved in many other things. But when he said that, that was the origin of the book, I felt suddenly that maybe it's possible to write a book about his classroom. I have lots of notes in the file cabinet behind me, in my very messy, active office and studio. A lot of material and a lot of contact with students. That was the beginning of the book. I was able to share early sketches of the entire book, as well as an early draft of the first chapter before Professor Wiesel passed away. After that, I was writing during the year, mostly during the year of grieving after he had passed away. And one of the things that I discovered, which is, I think, not a new idea, but I experienced it in a new way, was that I continued to learn from him. And so for every ounce of grief that I felt, there was an ounce and a half of gratitude. And that was the experience of writing the book. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Another question we had was, with his love of questions and questioning, was Passover his favorite holiday? And did you ever get to experience the Seder with him and his family?
It's such a great question. He loved Passover. And if you asked him what his favorite holiday was, he would probably say the one that's coming up now, the one that's coming up next, because he loved all of them so much. He had memories from his childhood. He had questions about each holiday that gave him great inspiration to consider. He did have a special connection to Passover, though, because Passover is all about memory, after all. And it's choreography, an ancient technology that has worked to sustain memory. And so for him, it becomes a model for how to transmit memory. And to the second question, I never had the privilege of spending a Passover Seder with Professor Wiesel, except in the sense that many other people have had of using Professor Wiesel's Passover Haggadah. He wrote a Haggadah, a commentary on the Passover Seder, illustrated beautifully by Mark Podwall, and I've spent many Passovers with that Haggadah at the Seder. And so when I'm with that Haggadah, I feel his presence, which is still with us and still very much available to all of you if you're interested. It's easy to find on Amazon and so on. And his questions and his answers and his warmth really come through.
Excellent. And I have one final question. This is Judith from Worcester, Massachusetts. Once we're missing a few dots in the story, from you meeting him in a receiving line to then becoming the author of his book about his classroom and his institute. How is it, and I imagine, again, as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, there were probably a lot of people who were hanging on and wanted his attention. What's the cement that kind of bound you both together over all those years?
That's a great question. And to some extent, it's still mysterious to me, but do we have another 4 hours? I can tell you the whole story, but I'll tell you just a snapshot of one moment that captures something. So after a couple of years, 3 or 4 years of spending time periodically visiting Professor Wiesel, bringing my questions in a very informal way and a sporadic way, I enrolled in Boston University. As I said, I was in his classroom, and my goal for that class was very clear. My goal and purpose was to sit in the corner and be ignored for the entire semester. I was very shy, and I was very intimidated to be in Professor Wiesel's classroom, even though I knew him a little bit by then. I was surrounded by 65 or 70 students, many of them older than I was, from around the world. And I didn't say a word the whole semester, except once when Professor Wiesel asked a question about the book we were reading. The book was Loving Kindness by Anne Royfie. And he asked a question, and he looked at me, and he looked at me for a long time, and he continued to look at me. And there was a long silence, and I had no choice but to respond because he was putting me on the spot. And I said the word that was in my mind. The word was authenticity. And he nodded and smiled and said, exactly. And a few weeks later, he asked me to become his teaching assistant the following year. So first of all, I tell audiences all the time, if you're ever looking to fundraise or to get a job or to get someone to go out with you, just use the word authenticity. It's like a magic word. That's how I felt. I felt like somehow this was a magic word that opened a gate that I didn't even know was there. And I declined Professor Wiesel's offer because I was on my way to Israel to study in yeshiva, in a traditional school of Jewish text and Jewish thought. And I wrote him a letter explaining my decision. It was a difficult decision, to say the least. I wrote him a letter, I called him up, and I explained, and I said, did you get my letter? He said, I did. I said, and? He said, you know how much I value learning. I applaud your decision to go and learn. And then he said, I'll wait for you. And I thought he was just being nice and letting me down easy. But he really meant it. And 7 or so years later, when I went to see him after I had become a rabbi, and I went to Professor Wiesel to ask his advice about a couple of different professional opportunities, he said, why are you considering any of those things? I told you I'd wait for you. Come and do your PhD with me and be my teaching assistant now. And so there was something there. That was an important moment, but it's mysterious to me still. I don't know why he chose me to be his teaching assistant. I really don't. He might have liked the fact that I was shy, because he was a shy young man too. He might have liked the fact that I had a lot of questions, that I had some traditional Jewish learning in my experience, but I also had a relationship that complicated that fundamental reality of being a traditional Jew. But this is guesswork. All I can tell you is that that was the beginning of a new level of intimacy and relationship, because we were meeting every week and we were working together to build and respond to the course and students' needs. And then we started studying Torah every week. And then I started sharing more personal questions. And then I sang a few bars of a song to him for the first time, and he came out from behind his desk and gave me a hug, whereas before we had only had handshakes in our relationship. There were moments that created deeper and deeper connection. In any relationship, you can't really explain it, but there was some kind of connection there. And what that means now to me is that, like any good student, I have a responsibility to pay that forward and to share that, to share his teachings, to share that warmth, to share the glimmer of humor and the ability to stay with darkness in the world, to challenge it, to protest it, to not lose sight of hope and joy. And that's what I'm doing now. That's my work really every day now, in his spirit.
Thank you very much for that authentic answer and a wonderful talk. I want to also thank Larry and Gail and Bev and Karen for bringing Irene's story to us today and helping to make this talk possible. Also partnering with us to bring Rabbi Dr. Burger to us all is the Greater Vancouver Jewish Community Center, the Worcester, Massachusetts JCC, the Meyerson JCC of Cincinnati, and the Jewish Community Center of Louisville. I'm so thrilled that everyone could join us, and we will send out a link with the recording of the lecture today, and we'll keep you informed about other great Holocaust education programs we have at the Boulder JCC. Happy New Year, Shana Tova, happy and healthy for all of us.
Thank you all, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, thank you.
Shana Tova, thank you so much.